Thanks for listening. I'm not an expert on relationships, but there are some links to some people who are down below. I'm also not a theologian. I'm just sharing some thoughts. When we study the Word of God, looking at the content of a passage is a big part of Bible study. What is the passage actually saying? In Proverbs, it talks about stewardship. In the Gospels, it talks about salvation, among many things. Throughout his whole word, God shares a picture of himself. We get to know him and how to have a relationship with him, which is through his son, Jesus. One of the pictures God shares of the relationship between himself and the church is like a husband and wife. God is not just some distant boss, but he's like a husband who has a close relationship with his wife, cares for her, and looks out for her. In Song of Solomon, the passage is between a literal husband and wife. God was giving his children wisdom about marriage. In the book of Matthew, it talks about salvation and also the things that Jesus preached to Matthew and others about relationships with people. In Matthew 5:7, there's some examples of those things that Jesus preached about, like not being critical, don't judge, not just looking at other person's sin, but our own sins, etc. In the parable of the tree, Jesus talked about the tree growing and it needing grace and truth over time to grow. There's a lot of practical things the Bible talks about growth that I didn't realize until I read, and some of the stuff that Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend wrote about the Bible and its wisdom and how to apply it. I was pretty far behind. One question Ravi Zacharias liked to ask was, what's God's part in man's responsibility? When we get saved, God gives us a new heart with new desires. We still have to do things like renew our minds and grow in relationship with people, like Matthew mentioned, and also grow in love, like Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 13. If everything was taken care of when we got saved, we didn't have to grow in any areas. Jesus wouldn't have brought it up, but he did. He has whole passages where he talked about. In the Beatitudes, Jesus talked about character traits he'd like his people to possess. And any of the characteristics talks about, whether it's fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, or the characteristics in the Beatitudes, it's a growth process. God doesn't expect somebody to have it right away. It's something that we grow into and mature into. It's like learning how to write. You don't start out when you learn how to write how to do it perfectly, but you grow into it. And the same thing with character. It's something that you grow into. God doesn't expect us to have it all right away. In Matthew 5:5, he talked about humility. Meek, another word for humility. He talked about people processing stuff instead of stuffing it or burying it under an addiction, which is what it means to grieve or mourn, biblically grieve or mourn something. In Matthew 5:5, he talked about being the right kind of needy and vulnerable in a relationship. That to have good relationships, you have to be vulnerable in a good way, adult way, not like a child to a parent. It can get kind of confusing for a Christian, especially if they're new, that just because there are things that God, Jesus, might ask us to do, that doesn't mean we're earning his love. That grace brought us salvation, but we were kept by works. Grace brought us to salvation, and we are kept by grace. We never earned God's love in the first place. He loves us unconditionally. It's like having good, healthy parents who love their children unconditionally. They may ask them to do chores or finish their homework, but the child isn't earning their love. He's just doing it out of the grace and love of unconditionally. The difference is a life that is fueled by grace, like a tree with deep roots that get life from sun and rain, as opposed to a King Sisyphus type person who keeps trying to push a huge rock up a hill, trying to get someplace, and he never gets to where he's trying to go. Stewardship and maturity is not earning God's love. Maturity is becoming an adult. The Word of God is huge. Sometimes the pastor can't fit everything in a sermon. That's okay. The preacher usually focuses on salvation in the pulpit. That's appropriate since a big part of their job is helping people know God and be connected to him. We learn about salvation, then we study the Bible to get the principles and wisdom for Christian living. It's funny, sometimes I used to think that because I was focused on something else, maybe I wasn't worshiping God, Worshiping God means taking your life and centering around Him and your decisions. And just because you're focused for a moment on something like homework or washing the dishes or whatever, doesn't mean you're not worshiping God. It just means that you're human and you're just thinking about that thing. But your life is still worshiping God. Worship of God is all through your life with the threads running through everything.